indigenous people should be central to the discussion on nature and culture. We also discussed about the issue of criminalizations. We also discussed about the issue of indigenous people's participation in decision making. And we also highlighted why the rights-based approach to conservation is very much needed to be embedded in the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. And then IAFB members have been closely following the discussions, different contact groups, and also having informal meetings with different groups. So we are here today to update you what has been the progress so far, what is our assessment, and some of the recommendations as International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity. So with that background, I would like to invite Georgie Carino to share with us some of the progress and reflection. Georgie?
Thank you very much, Lakpa. So I'll just give some general comments assessing where we've reached in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework as this relates to indigenous peoples and local communities. First, I think we want to welcome the fact that there is now greater openness and understanding within the Convention on Biological Diversity and this process to value the contributions and rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. So this is reflected in a number of core sections of the framework, while recognizing that there are still key goals and targets under negotiation. There is a section which was often referred to as BBs, particularly now paragraph 9, which addresses and recognizes the vital role of indigenous peoples and local communities to conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity. This also includes recognition of the importance of traditional knowledge, innovations, and practices in the implementation of the convention. Importantly, it also recognizes that rights will be part of this framework, including free prior informed consent as contained in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So this is in a section of the GBF that frames, it's more or less cross-cutting and frames the goals and targets and its implementation. So we're quite happy about that. We know that traditional knowledge is also covered in Target 20, which is how traditional knowledge together with science and other knowledge systems will inform decision making. And again, free prior informed consent with the use of our knowledge is included here. Finally, Target 21, which is a target which gives a focus on recognition of the rights of indigenous peoples, women, youth, and also persons with disabilities is embedded in that target. And here, the rights to lands, territories, and resources is also part of it. So this gives us confidence that in large part, our issues are now cross-cutting in the framework as compared to the previous strategy when we were just focused on one target. There are still goals and targets under further negotiation, which our colleagues will be able to talk in more detail. Thank you.
Thank you, Georgie, for that very good reflections on BB's Target 20 and Target 21. Now we'll go to Ramson.
Thank you so much. My name is Ramson, and I'll talk a bit about resource mobilization in the Global Biodiversity Framework. As we are getting closer and closer to the end of discussions here, I think that each and every target and each and every topic is getting well addressed, maybe, and some are facing quite a number of challenges. We particularly have our own issues. In the previous times, we have always seen that whenever funds, indigenous peoples and local communities globally face related challenges, We don't have people who are special in terms of how they are treated than others. And at this time round, we are calling for some actions to be taken. Indigenous peoples and local communities funding systems have been made all the time smaller. Whenever we receive funds, it's always made smaller and with very strict reporting guidelines in a very short period of time. This time round, I think we should really try to make a change. And in this global biodiversity framework, we want to see changes, that we have flexibility in terms of many things. We need to have very much increased funding because we have seen indigenous peoples and local communities occupy very big territories of land and have controlling a lot of biodiversity in their lands. This can only continue if they are recognized in their lands and territories and be supported. And they cannot only be supported. Recently, I was saying we are not becoming partners in conservation. We are the real conservationists, and any other person who is coming to the lands of indigenous peoples and local communities becomes a partner to support our actions in the land. So we'd like to really talk about resource mobilization, being increased funding, directly accessing the funds, not only through intermediaries, but we need to have funds dedicated to indigenous peoples and local communities coming straight to us and to all regions. Indigenous peoples occupy 7 biocultural regions of the globe, and we are not discriminative of who received their funds and who is not. We would like the funding to be directly accessed by all indigenous peoples in all ecosystems of the world. We have also seen funding targeting different ecosystems such as forests. Our ecosystems are interlinked. The savannas, the arid and semi-arid lands, and the forests are all one thing, lakes and oceans. We would like to see funding coming to all these territories that we occupy. When you treat one and you leave the other one, you are making all the ecosystem vulnerable because we will all move to what is protected and we leave all the other lands. I think there is a high thing that we need to focus of also rehabilitating the dying nature in some other ecosystems that are not focused. And the last thing that I will say is about governance. Recently, we have done a research of 16 funds that are dedicated to put $2 billion in indigenous peoples and local community or community-led actions. But when you look at governance, it's only around 11% in average of the boards that are occupied by indigenous peoples and local communities. We're also calling to participate in the governance systems of these fundings that are dedicated to be implemented during the GBF, post-2020 GBF. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ramson. I think you have very clearly said indigenous peoples are the best conservationist leaders in the ground. And to support the people in the ground, you need to break those barriers and challenges of direct access to fund. Thank you very much. Now we will move to Jing.
Thank you, Lakpa, and I will build on what my other colleagues have said and address Target 3. So at this point, it's not clear if the contact group is going to further discuss Target 3. What we know is that we woke up yesterday to a letter from the COP presidency saying that Goal A and Targets 1 to 3 are going to be subjected to informal ministerial consultations. So at this point, we have been shut out of the process, and we have to reach out individually to the ministers in order to make our voices heard. You may have seen last week that we had an action calling for recognition of indigenous peoples' territories and customary lands and waters in the text of Target 3. We also managed to make a statement in the contact group making this point that we should follow the science. And the science shows that the areas that are most effective for biodiversity conservation are indigenous peoples' territories, indigenous peoples and local communities' territories. Now, of that area, only 40% is covered by protected areas. So that means that whether we have protected areas in indigenous territories or not, we still govern and manage our resources and our territories effectively. And if we're talking about an evidence-based, science-based post-2020 framework, we have to follow what the science says. Therefore, there should be an alternative pathway for recognition of indigenous and traditional territories that doesn't have to force us into OECMs and protected areas. We have to keep our eye on the prize. Target 3 aims to conserve areas so that biodiversity can flourish. And indigenous peoples are wanting that. It seems like we can't help feeling we are completely aligned with that aspiration of Target 3, but we cannot help feeling that there are technical roadblocks that have been put in our path. We have received questions, for example, like, wouldn't recognizing indigenous territory dilute the ambition of Target 3? But we remind everyone that Target 3 says at least 30%. And if we are talking about protecting areas that are most relevant and most important for biodiversity, or the key biodiversity areas, those are in indigenous territories. Does it matter what category we have in there or what pathway we use to recognizing good conservation practices, as long as we get to the goal of protecting biodiversity? So I hope that, just to cite one other thing, we have heard questions about the criteria and the definition of indigenous and traditional territories. And we would like to recall that in Nagoya 12 years ago now, OECMs had nothing in previous COP decisions even. It was never mentioned. It was a completely new category, and yet it was accepted in COP 10. So for indigenous territories, it has been there for a while in the COP decisions. Traditional territories have also been there for a while in the COP decisions. We are not starting from zero. So the main message here is, let us not be caught up in the technical roadblocks and instead look at the goal. And if we want to achieve the goal, we have no choice but to take indigenous peoples and local communities into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, for expounding on the rationale behind why IAFB is proposing for a third pathway in the Target 3. Thank you very much. Now we'll move to Sister Viviana.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. There is only 3 days that we have to finalize the negotiation. We are really worried because there is still a lot of text under negotiation. There is still a lot of brackets, and we really want to urge parties the adoption of the GBF. Of course, we want that this GBF of the Global Biodiversity Framework is a tool for indigenous peoples to to contribute to the conservation of biodiversity, the recognition of our traditional knowledge, the recognition of customary sustainable use that we have, and also the full and effective participation, and of course, the key role that we have in Target 3, that is on conservation. We have done a very long process of negotiations. We have to have this framework in 2020, and now its framework is until 2030. So it's like we have really, and the situation is really worse than 3 years ago. For this, we really urge that there is a needed to have a compromise to support indigenous peoples and local communities as partners in the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework. And we want that the framework is not something that affects of indigenous people rights. For example, if there is not recognition of our rights in Target 3, it can be a risk. So we don't want that indigenous people's land and territories are part of protected areas or are taken for governments to create more protected areas, because we know the reality. There is not a lot of land free. It's like it's our land who has the biodiversity. For this, we don't want this the situation that we are afraid of what happened with the implementation of the GBF. We want that this is a tool for indigenous people to protect their land and territories, to conserve biodiversity, what we have been doing for millenniums. And we are hoping that the ministers and the governments have this in their hand, their decisions, not only to reverse the crisis that we have today, but also to improve our situations, to take real action at the local level, but also for the next generations. We really think that we cannot delay the time for the adoption of the Global Biodiversity Framework, and we hope that it's approved and the parties are agree to delete the brackets around all the text that related to indigenous peoples issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Viviana, for stressing that post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework should support and strengthen the indigenous people's action in the ground and by no way should limit or weaken our roles and contributions. With that, I would like to open the floor for questions and clarifications that you would like to ask to our panelists. Or any contribution that you would like to make from your assessment of being part of the negotiations. Anyone? Okay, yes, please introduce yourself and ask the questions.
Hi, thank you everyone. My name is Lou. I work as an anthropologist and a campaigner for the Stop Ecocide movement. And this is maybe a bit of a radical question, but I hope you're up for the challenge. I'm curious about your thoughts on how to decolonize governance and decision-making spaces such as COP. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take 2 more questions if you have, so that we can do that in one round. Yes, please.
Mateo Similero, Canada's National Observer. I hear some global North countries in negotiations are pushing against the third category of Indigenous territories. I'm just wondering your assessment on that and why you think they're pushing or opposing it and pushing against it.
Thank you very much. One more questions and we'll... Okay, we'll get back to the... So can I go to Jennifer?
Well, to be clear,
Turn it off, Viviana, your microphone.
yes, thank you for the question. How do we decolonize? I think best model of decolonized governance is actually indigenous peoples. So we should be part of the process, actually. We hear lots of parties recognizing indigenous peoples, but we've always wanted to be able to speak in our own voice at these forums. We've had very limited spaces, and as I said, up to now, at this point, it's only the ministers who are going to be talking to each other to decide some of the very controversial items in the text. As for Target 3, yes, indeed, the technical roadblocks I was mentioning earlier were questions that we got from many countries, but most of them from northern countries. And maybe it's... I don't know if it's the way the mind thinks, but it's just that they've been involved and very engaged so far in this process, and they just keep recalling that, for example, for OECMs, it took 8 years before a decision on the definition could be adopted, and we've been trying to reassure them that in COP 14, 2008, we already had wording on territories and areas conserved by indigenous peoples and local communities in there. It's not completely new. It's been on the radar of indigenous of the COP for a long time. So that's why I'm saying let's not be bogged down by all of those technical agreements. Let's agree that we need indigenous peoples in order to get where we need to go, and then let's find a way, a creative way, to address the technicalities that are being raised. Because at the end of the day, those are not the things that matter. The technicalities, no?
Thank you, Jennifer. Georgie?
Yeah, I want to say something about the governance. I think there's a dynamic being developed here, whereas we have the global framework, and that really a lot of it depends on national implementation. On the ground, it is actually the actions of indigenous peoples and local communities and civil society who are actually transforming the way implementation will be happening. Therefore, even here, we are also putting our voices to transform the way intergovernmental negotiations happening. We're happy to see that this is now a whole of government and whole of society approach. We will definitely be very active for the implementation of this. We are also proponents for the human rights-based approach to suffuse the entire framework. And as has been brought out in terms of Target 3, but also Target 5, 9, talking about customary sustainable use, we are clearly putting forward proposals that will change the way conservation is happening, to recognize really that nature and culture and biological and cultural diversity are completely inextricably linked. So this is also changing the very paradigm and understanding of nature and people, and also who are the core actors in creating the transformation. That is also the underlying purpose of our advocacy here in this process. Thank you.
Thank you, Georgie. Maybe quickly to Ramson and Viviana, if you have any final remarks to make. We have 2 minutes, so maybe 1 minute each.
To the question asked, maybe I'll just give my own thought about why the 30 by 30 or something is. I think that whenever you step out of your house, things change and everyone thinks differently. And this is, I think, the arena where we try. It's not a conflict. It's just a way of understanding. People understand differently, and I think the approach of 30 by 30 may not mean the same in Europe. May not mean the same in Europe, Africa, America, everywhere. So people think differently. The way I think being an African is not the way maybe Viviana thinks coming from Latin America. So we think differently, and we need to come up to understanding.
Yeah, I think our proposal are just focus on what we have been doing for millennia is conserving, protecting nature. This is not something new that we want. We want only the recognition of the rule that we have been doing all these millenniums. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. I think we are finished our time. So if any one of you would like to talk to our panelists, you can meet after this press conference. And thank you, everyone, for joining our press conference. Thank you very much.